Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first lecture in the university's Challenge Your Mind public lecture series for 2013, this being day one of orientation week of our academic year, and also the early part of Canberra's centenary celebrations. My name is Stephen Parker. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at the University of Canberra. I'd like to acknowledge, as we try always to do at events like this, that we're meeting on land of which the Ngunnawal people are the traditional custodians, and I extend my respect to their elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Dr. Sarah Ryan, who is a member of the University Council and who chairs our Environment and Works Committee. So I'd like to welcome everyone, staff, students and friends of the university. Tonight's lecturer is Paul Roberts, whom I'll introduce to you shortly, and his topic, which is University Planning and Architecture, the Search for Perfection. But first, a few words about our own campus and maybe some scene setting. This campus, as I'm sure you know, is in the midst of what I would call a transformation, with this particular building, the Inspire Centre, being quite recently opened, and many other projects underway, including new student accommodation just outside here. We'll be opening teaching laboratories in a month or two. We have a sod turning for new health clinics coming up. We have an agreement over a new sports hub, a major sports facility, which may commence this year. And then you probably know that the government has announced that it will build the University of Canberra Public Hospital on the northwest corner of this campus. So a lot of development work has happened on campus, is happening, and is yet to occur. And we have a large amount of unused land, and this provides both opportunities and challenges for us. There are opportunities in that we can bring the world onto campus. We can engage with it, and in particular we can promote work-integrated learning for our students. And I guess the hospital's a great example of this. By bringing the world of health onto campus, it will be an enormous boost to our health education. There are also financial opportunities for us. The campus, in a way, is our equivalent of a traditional or long-standing university's endowment. But there are some challenges too, not least in coming to terms with what the long-term future of campus-based higher education is. My working assumption is that even as we continue to grow in size as a university, we will not build academic buildings at the same rate of growth, partly because students will come onto campus less and less for face-to-face education. And there may also be changes in the way that research takes place and the way that international collaboration occurs. So my judgment, and it's only a judgment, is that over time the UC campus needs to become more of a community resource, increasingly a high-level resource, engaging the community in intellectual, artistic and perhaps sporting pursuits. And there are other challenges lying in sustainability, given that our basic infrastructure was not built with these in mind. If you've listened to the audio file, which we have on our website, of John Gorton, the Prime Minister, dedicating this campus in 1968, there's a feeling of immortality about it, which we wouldn't share today. We know that we have to look after the resources of the planet in a way I don't think they were conscious of then. And of course, we face the challenge of climate change. We will be occupying buildings and building buildings for different climatic conditions. And I'm conscious, Paul, as I say this, I was listening to BBC Radio 4. There are motorists stranded in snow on British motorways, throwing snowballs at each other, whilst here in Australia we have both floods and bushfires causing loss of life. Something seems to be really happening with the world's climate, and we have to take that into account. So, ladies and gentlemen, Paul Roberts' talk this evening, University Planning and Architecture, the Search for Perfection, is very topical. His lecture will bring together two approaches, the historical and the strategic, to examine what constitutes a successful campus and how to apply these conclusions to real-life, modern-day contexts. His lecture forms part of a series he'll be delivering across Australia and New Zealand, and we thank him for taking time out from the Prime Minister's 11 cricket to speak to us here. He's been at the cricket, he'll be going back to the cricket, and he's just told me that he skipped dinner with the Prime Minister in order to give this lecture. As Director of Tunberry Consulting, Paul has been involved in a wide range of planning and development projects internationally, specialising in university campuses, sports facilities and estate-driven developments. His major campus development projects include some at the University of Oxford on the future development of a central Oxford estate, the Radford Infirmary, on a planning and development strategy for significant out-of-town landholdings, and on the development of a science park in Oxford. He's worked for the University of Hertfordshire, for Cranfield University and the University of Edinburgh. He's co-authored a comprehensive study of campus planning called University Planning and Architecture, published in 2010, and I have a copy here and a splendid production it is, and the University Library, I understand, has a copy of that work too. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Paul Roberts.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to talk to you. Jennifer has told me on the way, and she used to work for the Tourism Authority, and I received the most fulsome, impressive, comprehensive, and continuing valediction on the beauty of Canberra from the cab driver when I came here. It sort of led me to believe, of course, that you've got your 100th anniversary this year. It's this year in London is the 100th anniversary of the International Conference on Housing and Planning, which the Garden City movement in the UK started and created, and 100 years happens in the UK this year, and I'm sure Canberra will not be left out of that debate. So how did I get to this position, and what do I talk about? Sometimes you get involved in things that, with a little more age, you wouldn't necessarily do. And we have government research programs in the UK, and there was a project I bid for when I was in my early 30s, which I won. Today, I wouldn't bid for the project. I would deem it too hard. And that was for the withdrawal of the United States Air Force from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I thought it sounded quite straightforward. Was that really difficult? But it proved to be quite a challenging judgment to decide how to deal with all these redundant air bases when the US Air Force went like that. They went overnight and left us behind. And as a result of looking at those strategic issues, I was asked to do a project in 1999 called The Planning Requirements of the University of Oxford. In 1964, there had been faculty pressure for a fashionable solution to the university, a second campus outside the city. That was what the academics required. Because that's what everyone else. Harold Wilson had been to Stanford. He'd come back and said, I've seen the white heat of the technological revolution. This is it. We build a new campus like you have here. And they employed an individual called then William Holford, Lord Holford, who concluded in those words, it would be a counsel of despair if this university was to disregard the teaching of research and academic activity in central Oxford. And they decided not to build a second campus. And by 1999, they had got to levels of development per hectare that no other university other than Pennsylvania has got close to. And therefore we looked at a solution as to what to do and how to deal with that and how to deal with those issues. And in 2008, we did a comparative assessment of the university. How things work in England is, you talk in England and everyone says it's all a disaster, it's all a nightmare. We have no money, we have no future, we have no buildings, the rest of the world is streaming away. And I don't know how we get to the end of the week. You go to the US and you say, what do you think of Oxford? They go, unbelievable, I can't get over it. How do they do it, So we did an exercise looking at Princeton, Yale, UCLA, Berkeley and Stanford, top to bottom. University governance, whether the committees were okay, did they have a reasonable president? What sort of buildings did they build? How much did they spend? What was the balance of accommodation? Went through the whole thing. And two things I concluded from that. One is that actually in the UK we perhaps weren't doing as poorly as perhaps we thought. But the second thing I saw was decision making. This is in the two projects that were emerging in 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7. decision-making at a level that I found astonishing. And as a result of that, the book that the Vice-Chancellor has pointed to was an attempt to try and say to people, let's just be careful of how you do things and what you do. I'm a traditionalist when it comes to university development. I think you need a proper place to live, eat, learn, study, enjoy yourself, and be nourished. That's what you need to do. That's what it's about, and you should be uplifted in the process. And if you lose sight of that, you lose sight of what your objectives are and what your ambitions are. So today, I'm going to take you back through a historical walk as to where campuses got to where they got to, what the main schemes around the world are at the moment at a significant scale, and what some of the lessons might be from that process. So that's my sort of ambition for where I go. So let me start by completely turning on the head the Vice-Chancellor's comment about will there be campuses in the future. This is Bologna, oldest university technically in the world, 900 years in 1088. And Bologna created a place because other places like Padua and Vicenza kept stealing all their faculty all the time. Every time they got a group of faculty together, another city would come and say, come here, it's lovely. So they decided, what we will do, we will build something in this city which grounds them here. And that was the start of those sorts of movements, which is why you get places like, and you can see what places they were built in, Padua, Salamanca, that's Padua, that's San Carlos. But then a change occurred a very long time ago, 1264. Three principal universities operating at that time at significant level, Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris. And a split emerged which defines universities as you know them today. The split was as follows. The UK decided that pastoral responsibility for the student was part of a university's mission. We should house them, we should look after them, we should feed them. The French decided they would teach them and do nothing else. That was their obligation, to teach them. And as a result, this scheme, Merton College, 1264, was developed. The first bit, this little bit here, called Mob Quad, in a defensive system, that's it today, in a defensive system to try and allow that pastoral activity to set forth. And as a result of that, the Oxbridge solution of, this is the Bodleian, the old schools quad at Oxford. This is a scheme around the 16th century. And the Divinity School, where the Parliament of Great Britain took place for a period of time during the Civil War. You see these buildings were built. Similarly, Queen's in Cambridge, the old quad in Cambridge, King's in Cambridge. And you started to see what happened as we went through to get to the Sheldonian, Christopher Wren's first building and what he did. And the Wren structure, Trinity Library, meant that even back in the 1600s, that's Wren's library at the top, this very systematic arrangement, the support buildings, slightly more modest, the formal buildings, the grand buildings, this system had developed. But this system was not good enough for all. This system was not good enough for the US. The US did not like this fundamentally Catholic approach of defensive solutions. So they went a different way. So they went, this is Harvard, around 1668, Cambridge, Massachusetts. They went to a totally open system of development of campuses. We are the community, we are the place, you and us are the same thing. So the first US buildings, unlike Mob Quad at Merton, which was enclosed, were places like Cutler in Ohio, Nassau at Princeton, open to the road, Dartmouth, open to the road, Yale, open to the road. These were single liner buildings developed in a single format in the community. And then three things happened in the US over a similar period, which again are defining factors. The first thing was that this is the first time that one individual decided that there should be a pedagogic solution embodied in a physical building. And that was Thomas Jefferson and the building of UVA. His decision was, this is how I wanted to be taught. I don't think that is how I was taught, but this is how I wanted to be taught. And therefore he built what he called the academical village. He built his house at the hill so he could look down over the construction. And he built this simplistic arrangement of the rotunda and then these little pavilions, which were the academic ones and the scope for growth over time. And he built that concept into what it is today, and that is UVA today. And the richness and depth of these back spaces and where it's been continued at the bottom and everything creates a campus which is arguably, on a non-academic basis, although it's a very high academic standard, the most sought-after environment for any student to wish to aspire to in the US. No one says, I'm at UVA, or they go, oh, right, badge call. Doesn't happen. So how material is this to the success of UVA over time? So that was the academical village. And today, the highest scholars of the university have the honor of living in the small rooms of the oldest buildings, and that is something to which those people aspire. But some people thought this was a bad plan. Frederick Law Olmsted. Mr. Olmsted thought that places like UVA would lead to, fundamentally, the following. Gambling, womanizing, prostitution, drugs, alcohol. None of these things were good, in Olmsted's view. And therefore, what you should do is build a rural campus, totally secluded in an informal environment, away from everything else. And this is his first plan for the College of California, what became Berkeley, that was rejected by the trustees of Berkeley. And he wrote a book called How Not to Build an Agricultural College, to tell them why they got it wrong. And that led to places like Iowa being built in this totally bucolic environment. So whilst Jefferson's going in one way and Olmsted's going in another way, the Beaux-Arts movement in the US starts to develop some of the most unbelievably monumental schemes that have been developed ever. This is Columbia, McKinley and White, 1905, built as a single set-piece scheme in Manhattan, of a scale and an impact, but as someone who goes to the campus, something that you feel isn't monumental, these are, as you can probably see, huge buildings, very, very significant buildings, but it still has a view to the street and an academic feel that is attractive. And this started a series of planning. This is Rice in Houston, a series of very orthogonal, organized planning based to a system, based to a general plan. The United States based things on a general plan, and you pursue the general plan, and I'll come back to look at Rice right at the end to see where Rice is today. But it was built on a structure that's built in the 20s, later on a structure of what it should be. Same at Stanford, you can see we've got a consistent theme now going through the US. And when you look at today, and you look at the most prized campuses in the world aesthetically, these will be amongst the group that people look to. But they are simple, they are buildings around a lawn, generally. And that's the Stanford experience. A stunning picture. This is University of Maryland. You know, just a very, very interesting, difficult picture. Johns Hopkins, which takes the highest single income from the Institute of Health in the US in any 1 year as a university, still built around the structure of that typical Jefferson academic model. So when I talked about why things were very different in Europe, things were very different because Le Corbusier said, as we'll come on to later on, an American university is a city in itself. That wasn't the case in Europe. So whilst you had schemes that were single buildings, this is Havana, the European university looked like this. This is Graz. It was one building, generally. It was a building of such magnificence that as a student you felt it was a treat and honor to go there and learn. But it was one building. This came back to haunt these universities later on when science was established. 1855 was the first scientific activity at the University Museum in Oxford when laboratory activity took place on a significant academic scale. So that's Graz, that's Lund, and that's London. Whilst we looked at all these universities so far, in 1209, England had 2 universities. In 1826, England had 2 universities. So always a statistic that some people find somewhat surprising, to think that over that 650 odd years, no one thought, I know what we'll do, we'll have another one of those universities. Scotland couldn't get enough of them. England, it's not what you're going to do. So whilst all that happened, and you moved to these single set-piece buildings, Cape Town, quite a stunning place, all of a sudden, a thing started to happen, which was the Gothic revival, which changed many, many things. And you will know this from your activities. You get places like Liverpool are developed, a mercantile university coming out of the sort of Victorian activities. Manchester, Sydney, Adelaide, start to see what's emerging through this process. And then all of a sudden, even Perth, all of a sudden, you start to get a change which occurs with a decision of those US universities that the open system that they had sought after, that they wished to, they had concluded did not work for them. And they were now going to turn against their community. So they've been going along for a few hundred years and have now decided that's not how we're going to do it anymore. So what do you do when you get to Harvard and do that? Or you go to Bryn Mawr in Philadelphia? They don't say Bryn Mawr, by the way, because I'm from Welsh. I'm from Wales, I can say that. One of my friends told me it was fashionable to have Welsh ancestry in Australia, but I'm not absolutely sure that's the way forward. Does that tell you you can go in there, or is that saying we are in here and you stay out there? So all of a sudden, the European system has totally changed. So the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893 starts to go, this is a Rockefeller-funded scheme by Cobb, and all of a sudden, what do we see? We're back to Merton College 1264. The US has completely gone around into a Gothic revival solution, which is all about saying you keep out and you come in this way. This is part of the Chicago scheme. And then you see a university like Yale, which had been an open, outward-facing university. Yale then decides to go to the quadrangle to add that Gothic nature and to just take it away and just leave you with something. But whilst all these things have been going on, they've been going on a basic domestic scale where they're trying to provide accommodation to live in, to be taught in, to enjoy. And then there became a subtle change where the buildings were not developed to serve the members of the university, but the members of the university had to serve the buildings. All of a sudden, things changed around, and we got a much greater pace of development. Until this period of time, even with Jefferson's academical village, if you look at what Jefferson designed when he started to what is there now, it's probably a 50th. Same with Rice. All of a sudden, we were operating at a different scale, and a different scale means a different method of decision-making. So all of a sudden, we go to, straight after the war, international style, Van der Rohe's Illinois Institute of Technology, modest in its overall scale. You then move to Florida Southern, Lloyd Wright. You start to see now, okay, so this is very different from where we are before. Black Mountain. And then, most significantly, Chicago Circle, University of Illinois. Walter Netsch. He's now building a single scheme in one go as a complete university, as a megastructure. Huge towers, similar to the UN Tower built in Manhattan. A central platform for student activity, defining how student activity will work. Defining how open space will work, the lecture theatres, the administration. And moving away from what we saw a little while ago, when we were only looking at that, to a student experience that was that, in an incredibly short period of time. The issue about the megastructure is it's very often one individual designing a single scheme, implemented in one go, with their ideal of how you should be educated. It doesn't have a chance to ebb and flow, to wax and wane, to be adjusted. It happens. Like that, you've got it. If it's wrong, you've all got it wrong. If it's right, it's great. This was the start of the whole cloth campus. So Around this time, University of California built 3 campuses, Santa Cruz, Irvine, and Davis. State University of New York built a campus at Albany. These are massive systems, huge, huge systems. That's Santa Cruz. This is Simon Fraser in Vancouver, built in a 25-month period, a university built in one go to one approach. This is University of Sussex, Basil Spence. Britain had a whole series of new campuses in the 1960s. And the example I've showed you is this. This is UEA, University of East Anglia. And in the middle of the UEA is this. I haven't got very steady hands, but that is the teach-in wall. All teaching takes place in one approach, in one wall. That's your solution. All residences are in ziggurat form in this area. And when you look at the archive of Lasden and how he did it, one thing you cannot criticize is the depth of analysis, the consideration, the thought, the expertise. And that is the ziggurat form that UEA have been trying to resolve for a long time. But if we think that single large-scale schemes, that's quite hard to say, are the preserve of the UK, the US, Germany was in a class of its own. Because Germany did this. These buildings, this is at Bochum in the Ruhr, they built these buildings, 91 of them, in 15 months, to the same design across Germany. At this scheme, and I met someone who went to university here in the Ruhr, had all student activity here, so that when you were at this part of the site, you could focus entirely on your academic work and the idea that it was a 9-to-5 existence. There was no flexibility of learning as to how you did that thing. And this is the standard building that emerged. And Germany built more megastructures. This is the Free University of Berlin. You can see it's a single structure. This is an integrated structure, which has been rather delightfully refurbished by Norman Foster, but still, it came its way. Then we get a small reduction, where there's a sort of postmodernist approach. This is Saarinen Mawson Styles College at Yale. So it's coming back now towards something more modest. This is Princeton Victoria Scott Brown. Williams Liberal Arts Cottage in Western Massachusetts. So you start to see a more modest approach. But then we start to get schemes happening in Asia. So you get Malaysian schemes which go back to these larger developments and larger schemes. And then we get one of the things that I'll come on to talk about, which is something that happened first in Australia to some extent, and then transformed to Spain, which is the Sydney Opera House effect, the Guggenheim effect, the implication of a star architect building an iconic building which defines your place. So you think something like that, that's Queensland, or that, which is Stephen Hall's residences. Those are residences at MIT, built by Stephen Hall, or the Starter Center at MIT. And I'll show you a picture in a different way of that later on. And you get to the stage where somebody decides, a vice chancellor probably, you know, out of control, unregulated, that the arrival experience for this university should be that. It's no, you know, you can't learn in it, but that's what it should be, because that is Arizona State, that a decision is made that that's how things want to go. So the implications as we get to the end of this first bit, that's Oxford if you need to work that out. The implications of this first bit are there have always been different systems operated in different countries and different approaches, but they tended to have a greater degree of similarity about the nature of, you know, live, work, learn, play, and how that works in relation to how you study. And it's only when we got post-war did you start to get the megastructure developments. It was the megastructure developments, the pace of developments, which allowed mistakes to go unchecked. Because if you make an enormous mistake, it's very hard to recover it. If you make a series of incremental mistakes, sometimes there are checks and balances. So if we look now what's happening now in the world, and this is a very difficult thing to do, mainly because there are lots of schemes here which people say, well, why didn't you talk about that one? Perhaps I'd never heard of it, never been there. I went to Victoria University on last Friday and saw a development of a hub that they're doing. in Wellington, an incredibly complex and difficult site, which was very, very impressive, and I will add it into future activities. But we just look at what's happening. And I split this in a number of themes, sort of new campuses, sharing schemes, community schemes, and hub schemes, which are the sort of 4 examples. So if we go back for a while to our recent developments, this is Columbia, went back to Columbia. So the McKim, Mead and White scheme was originally this. That was the set piece scheme. And this is a sort of 1970s podium scheme, and then this is the way they've sort of slowly grown. Because obviously for these sorts of places in Manhattan, growth is a very, very difficult issue. And the difficult thing is that they had a real problem in the 1970s where they were constantly trying to buy land. Princeton was very similar, Berkeley was very similar. Let's buy the neighboring community and try and transfer. It's a very difficult political environment to work with it. So what Columbia have done for a very long time, moving, as we saw earlier on, from where they were, is they did 2 things. One is, when they were in a period where they couldn't go anywhere, they realized that they're quite a dysfunctional campus in terms of its landscape, its signage, how it felt. And they did the most comprehensive makeover. Do you have those sort of gardening programs in Australia where, you know, oh, you've just done one, haven't you? Did you? But it was your own labor. Yeah. And this is what Columbia did, and it's a dramatic impact for the number of dollars they spent on the overall environment of the campus. It's probably the most successful landscape scheme I've ever seen at any campus. But they went through that process to take it back to where they went to, but they're now embarking on a thing called the Manhattanville campus. Similar sort of approach in Harlem, a series of blocks. That's phase 1, and that's phase 2. So you get a feeling, anybody who's been to Manhattan, as to how big this sort of scheme is and what's involved. And how do they deal with this? So how are they going to take what is arguably one of the most successful campuses that have ever been developed and try and do that again now in the 21st century? So they went to Renzo Piano and SOM, and they've essentially done it around a public square. So they've gone back 94,000 square feet in the US terms, public square, moving away from the enclosed environment that they all enjoy on the current Columbia site to a much more public environment. So this will be accessible to the public, all areas accessible to the public. All those facilities that are the university cafe will be open to the public. So is that good? How is that going to work? What happens? And this is the first building, the Green Science Center, built again by Renzo Piano. And you know, when you look back and you look at what they did 100 and whatever it was, 11 years ago, you look today and you look forward 100 years, how will this sit? How will the piano scene skip? That's the really difficult challenge they have to deal with. The second scary one is this is Cornell. Cornell was founded in 1865-ish, and it's in about 5 hours drive from New York up towards Buffalo. There's a big car park under there, for those that have car parking problems. And it's designed in a modest way, but it's a very well-ranked, highly regarded university. And if you think about this, this is New York City, Empire State Building, Chrysler Building, Roosevelt Island. This is a $2 billion scheme, a joint venture between Cornell and Technion in Israel, so Israeli Research University and a US university coming together to build a new campus 5 hours from the closest campus they have. So not NYU, not Columbia, but Cornell. But done in a way, on an island, again, masterplanned by SOM, that looks like this. And what I think about this is, in 100 years' time, will that be a place that I would do anything I could as a student to be there? Is that offering me a student experience? If a member of faculty, is it offering me a faculty experience which is going to work for me and what's going to happen? Because the solution is, again, to push the boundary. There will be a rationale to this, a system. There will be an approach as to how it's done and what's happened. The next one I want to look at is a very difficult one. Central Cambridge, historic core of Cambridge, floodplains, library development in the 1930s, Sidgwick site in Cambridge, which is a sort of arts humanities site, law is in that area, and a whole series of colleges that have sort of jumped this floodplain area as part of Cambridge, more modern in design. Cambridge doesn't have the industrial background that Oxford has. Oxford has a greater industrial background. An industrial background means surplus land, scope for redevelopment. Cambridge is developed. It doesn't have the same capacity. And therefore, it's Queen's, that's the bit of floodplain they can't build on. That's the university administration. If you're thinking about getting a new building, you sort of, go for one of those. You know what we're talking about, the museum. And this is the issue. So this is the historic core. That's the Sidgwick site there. This is the library here. And this is the West Cambridge Master Plan. I can't think of a site in UK terms. This is what's so challenging. It's very easy for me to stand here and say, I'm not sure this is very good, or I'm not sure this is going to work. Or you try and go the other end and try and do it and see if you can make it work. This is the West Cambridge Master Plan. It's been probably 25 years in development. It's fundamentally scientific computing based. But when you look at the buildings that have emerged through that process, and you look at, that's the Bill Gates laboratory, no guessing how that got to where it got to. That's the Wilkinson Edinburgh building. If I showed you this and I said, where is this? Unless you knew, you wouldn't say Cambridge. Is that a mistake? Should it be? It just shows, have they considered it? Probably. It just shows how difficult it is to deal with it. This is Imperial College in London. Controversial scheme. But again, would you say that's a university if you didn't know that was a university? Would you go that way? And more importantly, that building has taken up a very, very precious part of 7 acres as a commercial development to cross-subsidise the balance of the scheme. So this is West London, so that's not hard. But if we think of going back to the German examples, this is King Abdullah University, Saudi Arabia. And you look at the size, and you think, okay, is this going back to where things were in the 1970s? Has it gone on, or is it going in the same way? This is Kuwait. So central core, similar to Heriot Watt in Edinburgh, academic buildings, a little bit of car parking. And again, buildings that are single-contained set-piece buildings, built in a particular way, because it's a perception that as a university, this is progress, and this is the only way you can deliver the environment you need to deliver. It's a very challenging thing to try and deal with. You again see these serried ranks of large-scale buildings in a particular set-piece arrangement. And this one, so be very careful with this one, because if I put that if I put it near a microscope, you would put it under it. You would think, I need to study that. And it's the University of Gambia. And I can guarantee you that those people who are organising the development of the University of Gambia will have a perfectly worked out, thought through rationale as to why they should build a university in this way. I just can't imagine what it is. But there will be one as to how you can imagine that this delivers. It'll be something climatic. There is a university in Qatar, which is quite difficult to challenge. So you start to see that if you work on the basis that the two most successful moderns in terms of student perception of an attractive environment, physical perception, is the late 19th century US model and the Oxbridge model. Whenever anybody graduates towards a new development of some kind, they completely disregard that, absolutely. That doesn't mean the only solution is to copy what that is, but it's quite interesting the way that the way these go. Two other things which are happening at the moment is joint ventures. This is Yale and the National University of Singapore. This is an attempt to implant the US liberal arts college culture into other parts of the world. If you don't understand the US liberal arts college culture, it's basically a single degree undergraduate, no science, no research, very high quality. Been very difficult to embed into other parts of the world. But you start to see how you have a mixture of low scale, high scale. It's quite an interesting scheme. And this is Liverpool and Zhejiang. But again, go into a very large scale of activity. But scale is a big deal because, and I had to, I can't possibly remember this. Universities in France have generally operated, this is a grossly unfair generalization. Universities in France generally operate in terms of trying to spread out the students to go to their local regional universities and have a whole series of universities that are relatively equal in academic competence. Of course they aren't, but that's how it works. And Sarkozy came up with a scheme, Paris-Saclay, 2008, to have a new campus, 23 professional research organizations, 2 universities, 1 higher education establishment, 6 research institutes, 10 private engineering companies, 3 business schools, to have 58,000 students, 36,000 staff by 2025 with a 25 billion euro budget and a site identified and ready to go. And in Sarkozy's terms, that is the only way that France, given where it's got to, in their words, can start to compete with Oxford and the Ivy League in the US. There is no other way they can go. University of Buffalo has a $7 billion scheme going on. These are massive schemes. And the French scheme will happen, it will happen quickly. But the biggest scheme, this is the Marie Curie scheme in France, and this is another very, very significant scheme in the centre of Paris. The question I've got to ask is, does the building really need to be the leading therapies, or is that really going to help the overall ambitions of the university? But there's a flippant. And this is something which your Vice Chancellor can comment upon. This is a scheme in London, joint scheme, Cancer Research UK, Medical Research Council, the Wellcome Trust, Imperial College, King's College, and UCL. If you'd said to me, 2004, those universities who have been competing, would you say bitterly, aggressively, for decades for supremacy in London, would all come together without their own front door and go into the Francis Crick Research Institute, because that is the only way in a world of decreasing capital they can make it work. Now, the research exercise in the UK and the way research is distributed, similar to some extent to Australia, might make this a difficult challenge. But this is some of the changes that are being driven by the lack of availability of capital in the world and why those things happen. This is La Trobe in Melbourne. Again, driving towards joint schemes. Australia has a number of joint schemes. Again, Melbourne, Flinders, can't remember the previous one, James Cook again. So you start to see how capital is driving universities to fit together and join together when they'd never previously have comfortably sat in that space. The next issue, which has fundamentally changed in the UK, because we've got tuition fees in the UK which are starting to get competitive to some extent, the student experience is now on the radar in the UK like it's never been before. People are saying, what do students want? What do students like? Not, this is what I did when I was a student. Yes, that was 35 years ago. Well, it doesn't matter, you're going to have it anyway. Right? So it's a much different approach. So this was a pretty bleak part of the University of Exeter with some pretty bleak 1950s buildings scattered around. And essentially all of this and underground becomes the new heart of the university, developed in a warm and attractive way. This is 3 universities coming together in Central St Martin's in King's Cross into an old building, which looks old, but is then of a nature and a scale that is attractive. This is a student centre in DC. Again, very significant schemes being developed in that way. And this is the university, this is one in Adelaide, again, and this is what I saw in Victoria. So, for the first time, moving towards substantive, planned, organised, large-scale student experience schemes, because this is how the world is moving as far as these perceptions are concerned. That's the Adelaide scheme. So 4 things that sort of, as we get towards the end of this process, you start to, oh no, I've got one more to go, one more trend to go, sorry. the community. Very much a US issue. I don't know how many people, it's a very young audience, but apparently if you're American, your aspiration when you finish studying is to go and live close to the campus you were a student at. That's what you want to do. So you can participate in their civic activities, their sporting activities. You can give them all the money that you always wanted to give them because that's what you always wanted to do. And you essentially return to what your roots were, and there's an increasing demand for this sort of activity. This is a scheme called Hendricks College in Arkansas. This is their alumnus scheme being developed in this part of town here. This is the main academic campus. You see the nature of it, it's a modest scale activity. And you start to see how they've developed it in a very specific way. This isn't just, we'll sell some land for housing. This is a driven, particular approach to drive the funding of their university. And it's there, it's on site, it's started, it's going ahead. Simon Fraser did a very similar thing. Simon Fraser here, Vancouver in the background. They decided to embed a huge residential scheme into the university and build a settlement and a place, which is very, very different. Harvard are doing something rather different. The Harvard Austin Master Plan, so you know the Harvard structure, that's the Harvard Yard. These are the buildings that contained the yard in the 30s. This is Harvard here, the Harvard Business School here, Harvard Stadium. This is the Alston site, which they're working on now. And it's been a much master plan. It's a bit like the West Cambridge Master Plan, you know, very faculty-based university, a lot of involvement of faculty, relatively slow moving, relatively difficult to get going. And this is their plan. This is Harvard Business School here, academic space here, and they're trying to work out whether they can produce a commercial residential scheme that links Harvard to the community. And they've developed the first scheme. There'll be a reason for this. They want to pay to like a brand consultant. It's called Barry's Corner down here. Do you think it's a rather incongruous name? Either Barry is very wealthy, or I'll get a letter from someone soon telling me why, no doubt. But this is their attempt to create a purely commercial scheme to bridge the community gap between Harvard and the rest of the rest of Alston. So again, a very interesting scheme that they're trying to do to work through those issues. And finally, the most difficult one, the Northwest Master Plan at Cambridge. Cambridge has chronic housing problems in terms of academic affordability. Cambridge is one of the highest priced places to live in the UK, and academic staffs are quasi-public in the nature of the academic staff. As a result, affordable housing. So you're at the University of Colorado at Boulder, living in your 4,500 square foot, 400 square meter house. You take a position at Cambridge, you move, and you are in a 80 square meter house, because that's all you can afford. So a real problem in those sorts of issues, which is why they have professorial housing schemes, professorial loan schemes, various other schemes. But the solution to that is to build Northwest Cambridge as a residential community. But of course, what they don't want to do, although some people say it's a great solution, is have a large housing scheme full of faculty members. Would that be what you really want? That's all you've got, right? You live with your colleagues permanently all the time. So they want to have a mixed solution as to how they do that. So they're just working through that now, and they're working through a master plan as to how Cambridge are going to build this community, which is going to essentially operate for the benefit of the university and operate for the benefit of the financial aspects as well. And you see the distinction between the central Cambridge and how it goes. Okay, so what does that identify to me in terms of lessons and the interesting point about lessons? There's 4 things I wanted to really cover. The first one is the concept of master plan and the general plan. Master plans usually occur because there's either a chaotic development scenario or there's a need to do something. If you're in the University of California system, it's because the Board of Regents of California require you to do a master plan. Rarely are plans done, separately administered by people who aren't building the buildings, outside necessarily the executive responsibility of the university, and endure for the benefit of the university. That's quite an unusual situation. So if we take This is the University of Sydney 2020 master plan, which says as an introduction that the last comprehensive master plan university was 1920. 100-year anniversary between plans. So on what basis have they been operating in the interim? That's the question. This is Kirtland in Perth. They built this, they built that, and now concluded they should do a plan. So very interesting, the overall approach. This is Rice. Rice is very interesting. Rice has a general plan. And Rice has a group of people who have responsibility for the general plan. They're not the people who have responsibility for getting the next building built or fighting with the head of department what the next building is. And they have long terms on the committee of the general plan, which is outside the terms of their president. So these are people who hold this institution for the future and had a rocky patch. But going back from the original plan, because they should not have built that, and they should not have built that, they should not have built that. But what do all universities suffer with, which have historic plans? Labs, deep plan buildings. The scourge of all university planning is the need for deep plan buildings, the need for exhaust. So having got through that situation, and having, of course, developed a plan which had relatively light buildings, because when the plan was developed, that was the nature of the plan, and that is why they got to where they got to. They've now gone back and said, okay, this university, Rice, has the most controlled palette of materials of any university in the world. The brick, the stone. It is the control, I was going to say control freak, I can't say that, can I? No, it is a controlled palette. UCLA is similar, but Rice is the absolute best one. And they've gone back and said, why do people think we have an unbelievable campus? It's because of this DNA. Okay, let us at least go back and look at that DNA and say, let's not just let somebody who's on some sort of ego trip now go off in a different direction. Let's remember what we've done, why we're here, what we've done. And they go back to restore this access, restore that access, try and deal with these issues, and then try and deal with their first building in this area by an architect called Kieran Timberlake, which, even if modern, is an attempt in terms of scale and place to be relatively light in what it does. This is the building going into this location here, broken into two wings and done in that way. Because Rice appreciate that what they have is so precious and so special, they must look after it. The second thing is difficult 1960s activities. So this is Yale. This is the central core of Yale. This is what's called Science Hill. And the president of Yale, Griswold, from 1950 to 1963, 13 years as president of Yale, said that buildings should be like people. They should all be different. And the buildings on Science Hill are by Rudolph, by Philip Johnson, by Kahn, but it is a part of the university that nobody wants to go, nobody loves, nobody wants to be there. No one likes it, but Griswold, the president from 1950 to 1963, did what he thought was right. That's the DNA of Yale. You've seen that. And this is the science area precinct. That is a very tall building. This is an open car park. And what they decided to do was to start to stitch the DNA of Yale back into the science area. How do we get that connectivity? How do we get back to where we should have been? So one, they have a landscape scheme, and two, they build a building. It's essentially on all this area here. That is typically Yale, and starts to connect and take these things back together. So you see this is the Philip Johnson building in the background here. This is by Michael Hopkins. And all of a sudden, they are now stitching together what Yale is into decisions made in the 60s that perhaps shouldn't have been made. It's a very, very different approach to how they're going to do things. We talked earlier about the European universities, the major building in the centre of the town. The major building in the centre of the town came with a 1960s system-built set of labs on the edge of town. That's what you got when you did that. This is ETH in Zurich. There's Zurich in the backfield here. and a very, very difficult campus. So Zurich are now going through a situation where they're trying to wrap around and essentially increase the density to try and resolve the issues that they've had over the long period of time. Two more bits to get through. I mentioned earlier on the difficulty of the president or vice chancellor wishing to make their mark. Trust me, there are hundreds of them. Okay? A world-famous architect fawned into the vice chancellor. Member University Council, also very pleased about this. Weak facilities manager operation. And that's when you get, let's forget about the past, let's forget about the student experience, let's forget about the faculty, let's build something that gets into the papers and we can all remember. And we look at something like this Starter Centre in MIT. This is a Goody Clancy building on the far side, perfectly good medical science building. This is, no one at MIT will tell you what the budget is for this eventually. No one can know what it actually costs to build. But the interesting thing about this is that having got to this, and having looked at things like the Stephen Hall scheme, and seen what Frank Gehry designed for the Starter Centre at MIT, in Australia, you do that, which is the Starter Centre on steroids. Now, how does a university administration conclude that in terms of life cycle costing, maintenance, functionality, that you should really build that? It will be impossible to build. These bits will be built by an Italian cladding manufacturer. They will fall off in 15 years' time, and the company will have gone bankrupt. Yeah, trust me, it's what happens all the time. So it's remarkable that these things happen and get pursued. Arguably, one of the finest buildings of the 20th century was Louis Kahn's Salk Institute in San Diego. And I've been to that building, and I've been into the ducts above the labs. And Kahn's conclusion was that all he knew was what was going into these areas had not yet been invented. He knew that. They hadn't invented it yet. Didn't know what it was, just hadn't been invented. And he knew at that time that what was invented nearly tended to be bigger than what was before, and there was more of it. So his instinct was to double the size over the program he thought was likely to happen. And then he thought about dynamism and doubled it again. And when you go back to the Salk now, those scientists always want the old labs because they're the most flexible, best operating labs. They built some in 1997, not as well. So it's interesting as to when you look at a building like this in Melbourne, how flexible is that building? All we know is, the Vice Chancellor said in opening, that academic activity is a dynamic pursuit. I think they're all, my view is, hopefully my lifetime will be okay, because if it's going to happen in the next 10 years, I'd be struggling to get work. I think there will always be an aspiration to come to a place to study amongst a group of people and have that debate and activity. I don't think it will ever be wholly remote. But buildings always need to be flexible to change. You've got buildings at Oxford that have been in 4 or 5 different uses over a period of time and are still in use now, and something's gone back to the original use. But buildings like that is very difficult to see. We've got the American Embassy in the UK, Grosvenor Square, built by Saarinen, to the US State Department organogram of 1958. Do you think it works today? So they move into a new building by Timberlake, south of the river. And libraries, gosh dear, how many libraries have I seen? It's built to a specific requirement with specific needs of their time. Whereas to some extent buildings that evolve, as Perth do, evolve in their own scale. If you just look at 2 things to finish this up, to just demonstrate, all universities are short of capital. I've not met a university that's not short of capital. If you know one, let me know, I'll be straight there, okay? Are you short of capital? Yeah, okay, right. So, and universities nearly all do the same thing to different degrees. They teach people and they do research. So if you want to outperform another university, you should use your asset base better and more carefully apply your capital. There is no greater burden on a university administration than the application of capital. It is what should keep people awake at night. Might not, but it should. There are many university presidents across the world who do not bother at all about the application of capital because they haven't appreciated how decisions made 50 years ago. If I go through my career, I was involved in the science area in Oxford for the demolition of the Hans Krebs Tower. The difficulty was Hans Krebs is still alive. How do you ring someone up and say, by the way, that building that was named after you didn't even last your lifetime? You couldn't get that far. So badly conceived was it at the time. We've talked about Berkeley. Berkeley is a very attractive, very dense campus. And when you show someone a scheme like this, and this is why I was saying to Jennifer before it started, I got into quite a bit of an academic debate in Chicago, because there is still an aspiration in the US for a new building. All paths lead to a new building. All solutions are a new building. It shows that academically as a department, you're successful, you're progressive, you're moving forward, we've got a new building, aren't we doing well? It's a signal, it's a sign. What they had at Berkeley was a few stores, an old accommodation block, and a laundry. That's what law were offered. That's what they were, that's where they started, that's what they've got, that's what they are. They're doing okay. You go to the Faculty of Law at Berkeley, you think, wow. Because there wasn't a greenfield site, there wasn't 50 hectares. They had to do what they had to do. They had to use an existing group of buildings in a creative way to get a good solution. This is Perth. Is it Perth? Oh, I can't remember everything, I'm sorry. Because you've got a cracker next. Western Sydney. I thought it was Western Australia. But this was a very simple 1930s lab building that's taken to the old building to a new extension and produced in a way that any would be very comfortable to do so. It's not the solution to tear it down. So it's becoming, now what tends to happen, the debate I had in Chicago is they've got the old COP scheme in Chicago. They cannot convince their academics to go into the old buildings. My view was that's because you haven't educated them and you are not giving them the vision that they require, the vision like this. It's a very difficult thing to deal with how you do things. Because sometimes when you reuse an existing building, some people get carried away, as in this case. So you can, this is in Australia, it's in Melbourne. So you can get things into a very difficult area. I think what all that has shown, or what I've tended to show, is that there's a very rich history and diverse history of how campus has been developed. And it's a difficult time of restricting capital, people coming together, people sharing. And if ever there was a time to look backwards to some extent and understand what has worked in the past and seek to apply some of those principles to what's in the future, rather than just trying to rush off and make your mark in some shape or form, generally you'll be a better institution for it. So that's my lecture.